The last chance to get rich has come now. There is no time left. You will realize that all those who have some money in the world are taking advantage of every second to restructure their assets. This time is very likely to be the most terrible financial crisis in history. Those who do not follow financial news may not know, but stocks that have soared last year, just buy with your eyes closed and can make big profits, have now started to decline sharply. For example, the leading stock, NVDA, has fallen 28%. Tesla shares, which were soaring in October last year, thanks to Trump's policies, have now fallen back 46%. Giants like Amazon, Facebook, Google, any company you can name have all fallen at least 15% or more. This drop has sent countless investors into a state of panic, doubting everything. But what if this is just the beginning? If the market continues to plummet overnight, a series of leveraged investors could lose all their assets, will be forced to sell off their assets to cut their losses, leading to a global asset price decline. At that point, it is no longer a decline, but a full-blown collapse. This happened in 2000, 2008, and 2020, and now it is about to happen again. However, the scariest thing is not the market crash, but the fact that this is exactly what the U.S. government wants to happen. Why? Because only when the economy goes into recession, the whole world will pay for America. Have you noticed that the Federal Reserve of Atlanta, a branch of the Fed, once predicted that the U.S. first quarter GDP would increase by 2.3%? But by the end of last month, they revised this number from positive 2.3% to negative 1.5%. What does this mean? It means they are publicly admitting that the U.S. has entered a recession. Just a few days later, the data was revised again, this time down to negative 2.8%. What does this mean? It means that not only is the U.S. in recession, but the situation is much worse than originally predicted. So if when Trump is elected, the stock market goes up, then after he takes office, it will not go down. Break declaring a recession is extremely sensitive in many places, but even the U.S. government has publicly acknowledged it. A lot of official economic data is telling us that things are getting worse lately. I feel like those old people sitting on the stock market news a few decades ago, glued to the screen, watching Trump's every move to see what he's going to do to the stock market. Do you remember 4 to 5 years ago, Trump just sent out a tweet? The market reacted immediately when he kept asking the Fed to print money to stimulate the economy, making the market grow strongly. But what about this time? He didn't say a word about stocks. Why, just as I was about to turn off the TV, the U.S. Treasury Secretary came out and announced that the government's main goal right now is to keep long-term bond yields from rising too high. Simply put, they want to make sure that U.S. bonds can still be sold. What does this mean? Look at this chart. It shows how much money the Fed has left in its wallet. You can see that since 2022, their wallet has been shrinking. So what will they do? The answer is they will borrow money from the rich. The Fed will put U.S. government bonds as collateral, ask financial institutions and big players to lend them money. This is called a reverse repurchase agreement. Simply put, this is the ability of the Fed to borrow money from its own financial system. Look at this chart. The higher the blue line means the more bonds the Fed has to pledge to borrow money. In other words, the Fed's borrowing capacity is being pushed to the limit, but the opposite is happening. This blue line will drop to zero this month. That means even the Federal Reserve can't borrow money from its own financial institutions. There are only two possibilities. First, financial institutions really don't have any money. And if they don't have money, how can they lend to the Fed? Second, even if they do have money, they would rather hold cash than take the Treasury bonds that the Fed mortgages for them. So who will buy U.S. Treasury bonds? The Fed's purse is now almost empty, can't borrow. Large investors and financial institutions either don't have money, or if they do, they don't want to buy U.S. Treasury bonds while China, Japan, the UK, and many other countries have been dumping U.S. bonds in recent years, which means U.S. bonds are facing a liquidity crunch. In other words, they are no longer circulating in the market normally. Why is that? Because more and more people want to sell, while less and less people want to buy. That's why Trump's finance chief said that their most important task is to make sure that long-term U.S. Treasury bonds can be sold. The solution is very simple to make America great again. For example, the government will cut staff. Big corporations will also fire employees to increase unemployment. Then they will increase tariffs to create higher inflation in the U.S. Most importantly, they will impose sanctions on the whole world, even intentionally cause a financial crisis or economic recession, first destroy, then rebuild. That's how they make America great again. But for us, this is not the time to waste a good crisis when most countries in the world cannot escape this spiral. The money will find other safe haven, the assets we have prepared in advance. This is an opportunity not only to protect assets, but also to help create a new generation of rich. If you do not want to be a victim of this crisis and even want to rise to a higher economic class, follow my channel. I will continue to provide you with important information. And if you are afraid that you will forget what you just heard, please like this video so it will automatically save to your playlist so you can watch it again at any time. Now the question is, why U.S. bonds are running out of liquidity? Doesn't the U.S. just use its own money to pay off its debt? The answer is very simple: because the U.S. dollar is irrecoverable. What does that mean? Pay attention. U.S. Treasury bonds are essentially a cycle of borrowing, spending, collecting, paying. For example, previously, the Fed could print $5 trillion, then use this money to buy U.S. Treasury bonds, that is, lend to the U.S. government. Then the U.S. government will owe the Fed $5 trillion. Then the U.S. government will take this money to buy goods from all over the world, import everything. When this $5 trillion is spent, the U.S. government will have no more money, so what will they do next? This is when the capitalists come up with a plan. The U.S. has spent $5 trillion globally, so if they can recover $4 trillion, then the world will only have $1 trillion left, causing the whole world to fall into a shortage money. Then other countries are forced to continue selling goods to the U.S. to earn U.S. dollars. Now I can continue printing money to buy all the goods in the world, right? So how do I get back the money I spent all over the world? It's simple. I just borrow back from them. I sell them U.S. Treasury bonds and say, let's lend the U.S. government money. When the U.S. makes a profit, we will pay back the principal and interest. This means the countries that sell to the U.S. make money from the U.S., then invest that money in the U.S. The Americans are basically working for them to pay off their debt. As a result, the whole world uses some of the money they earn to buy U.S. Treasury bonds. The Fed prints $5 trillion. The U.S. government spends $5 trillion, then by selling the bonds they get back $4 trillion. So the world doesn't have too much surplus dollars, and the Fed can continue to print another $5 trillion to lend to the U.S. government. The U.S. government continues to spend and sell bonds to recover money and then print money. Do you understand? In other words, U.S. Treasury bonds are a mechanism for the U.S. to recover money from all over the world. Their goal is to do nothing but still be able to use the printed money to buy all the goods produced by the world. So it doesn't matter if the U.S. government currently owes $36 trillion dollars or even $100 trillion dollars or $1 quadrillion, as long as about 40% of this debt comes from other countries that lend to the U.S., then this system will still work. Normally, simply put, as long as the U.S. can recover the money they spent making the world short of dollars and continue to need dollars to trade translation, then they can continue to print money without any problem in theory if they continue to collect the debt U.S. bonds. It may not even need to be repaid. U.S. just need to take new debt to pay off old debt. For example, today, U.S. owes Japan $1 trillion, dollars, and this debt comes due at that time. U.S. will ask Japan, "Do you want to continue lending me? I will continue to pay you interest." If Japan agrees, the U.S. does not need to repay the principal. If Japan does not agree, the U.S. will borrow $1 trillion dollars from the UK to pay Japan. After 30 years, the U.S. will find a way to repay the debt to the UK. This is the tactic using time to exchange for space, or to put it bluntly, delaying by extending the time. The U.S. can reduce the pressure to pay the debt immediately. These things are not taught in textbooks, where people often think simply that debt must be paid. In reality, debt can be delayed. It can even be pushed onto others. But if the world sells goods to the U.S. and earns dollars, without using that money to buy U.S. Treasury bonds or lend to the U.S., then the U.S. will not be able to recover the money they have spent. Then they will not be able to continue printing money. Without printing money, they will have to work and produce to earn money to pay off the debt. This is a situation of U.S. bond liquidity depletion, and the current situation is like that. Previously, about 40 to 50% of U.S. debt was lent by other countries, but now it is no longer like that. Now of the U.S. debt, only about 20% to 30% is lent by other countries. This means that the money the U.S. has spent cannot be recovered. When the money does not return, it means the world will no longer lack dollars. If at this time the U.S. continues to expand its balance sheet and print more money dollars, the dollar will immediately lose its value seriously, making the whole world even less willing to use dollars and also less willing to buy U.S. bonds. Then the money will be even harder to recover. So what to do? Some people say that Trump is trying very hard to find ways to make money to pay off the debt, such as increasing import taxes, even selling U.S. citizenship. Just spend $5 million, you can become a U.S. citizen and immigrate to the U.S. This is really an international joke. As said before, the U.S. debt actually does not need to be paid and cannot be paid. If the U.S. really pays its debt, the entire global financial system will collapse immediately. Why? Suppose Trump succeeds in withdrawing money from all over the world, bringing money back to the U.S. But when he uses that money to pay off debt, the money is withdrawn from the system again. Moreover, the U.S.'s biggest creditor is the Federal Reserve. Previously, the Fed printed money and lent it to the U.S. government. If the U.S. government now repays this debt, it is essentially destroying that money, making it disappear from the system. So why does the U.S. have to print money? Because earning money by working is too hard, so they choose to print money, sell bonds to collect money, and then continue to print money. If now the U.S. not only stops selling bonds but also tries to pay off debt, they will not be able to print more money, so the U.S. does not need to pay the debt. Why should it pay if the U.S. dares to reduce the scale debt? Then this country will destroy itself because if the U.S. collects $100 million dollars and uses that money to pay off debt, while this debt does not need to be paid, then they will run out of money. When the U.S. has no money, the problem is not only that the U.S. stock market will collapse, but the entire Wall Street will have to close because there is no more liquidity. If no one has money, businesses will have no customers to sell to, so the economy will stagnate. Then the scenario that many people are waiting for will appear. Homes in the central area of the U.S. can be reduced to only $100 a house because the economy falls into deflation. But by then, most of the assets of everyone will also be reduced in value to only $1, and banks will also have no money to lend to buy houses. In other words, even if house prices fall sharply, then the value of assets also decreases. Most people will feel houses are still too expensive and cannot be bought. So don't think that the U.S. paying off its debt and causing deflation is a good thing. This only makes U.S. hotels cheap and the American people become poorer. So understand one thing no U.S. president dares to really pay off. The national debt paying off debt is just a slogan to tell the TV audience. The real task of the U.S. government is find every way to revoke the right to issue money, collect money from the world and continue to print money, that is, expand the scale of public debt. In other words, when the U.S. debt increases, the amount of money printed will also increase. The dollar will lose more and more value. Pumping money into the market requires assets to absorb. Otherwise, it will lead to uncontrolled inflation, cause asset prices to soar. So what is the advantage of small investors over big guys like Warren Buffett? Is flexibility. Buffett may have to prepare a year in advance to buy or sell assets, while we just need to wait for the moment when the money flows in to push the stock price up, and then it is not too late to place an order. In other words, the big guys create the trend, while we just need to follow the trend, make money, and then withdraw. Now pay attention. If you do not understand this part, you will not be able to comprehend the important content behind currently. The U.S. cannot take back the money because the world has stopped lending to the U.S. when the money does not return. That means you should quickly move your money into U.S. bonds, and you should not just buy regular U.S. bonds, but buy long-term bonds because the interest rates are currently at 4 to 5%. If you buy now, you can lock in this interest rate for 30 years. If you don't buy now, when everyone rushes to buy, interest rates will fall and the price of the bond will increase, making you pay more to own it in the future. That's why many people have been pushed into the race to buy long-term U.S. bonds from here. There are three possible scenarios. First, the most ideal outcome. U.S. bonds are sold successfully without the U.S. stock market collapsing. If so, no problem. But as mentioned before, bonds, U.S. and U.S. stocks, like two ends of a seesaw. Money flows into bonds, stocks lose capital flow. Currently, the amount of capital needed to compensate for U.S. bonds is very large. If you want to maintain balance, U.S. stocks will have to gradually decline over a long period of time. At the same time, still need continuous cash flow to support the market. However, this possibility is quite low. The second scenario has a higher probability and is also what we often talk about. U.S. bonds increase sharply because there are many buyers, but U.S. stocks collapse quickly, like the crises in 2000, 2008, and 2020, when the U.S. can withdraw money from bonds, allowing the Federal Reserve to expand its balance sheet, print more money. Without obstacles, the amount of money printed can be lent to financial corporations at near zero interest, so they can buy stocks at cheap prices, pushing the stock market back up. This is why Warren Buffett and major financial institutions are holding a huge amount of cash. Because whether the first or second scenario happens, U.S. stocks will fall first. Third, the worst scenario. U.S. stocks collapse, but the money does not flow into U.S. bonds, leading to both U.S. bonds and stocks plummeting. Then the U.S. economy will really fall into recession, and this recession will last. The reason is because if U.S. bonds cannot be sold, the U.S. government cannot get the money back, which means it cannot expand its balance sheet to print money to save the market. If despite printing money, the stocks can recover, but the value of the dollar will plummet. For example, you invest in U.S. stocks and earn 30% profit, but if the dollar depreciates by 40%, you still lose 10%. Then the shock will be huge because in the world there are still many countries holding a large amount of dollars. If the dollar-denominated assets fall sharply, then the entire world economy will be in trouble, triggering a global crisis. So why Trump is actively doing many things that damage the U.S. economy. In fact, he is holding a knife to the neck of the whole world, sending a message. If countries buy U.S. bonds, everything will be fine. But if countries continue to refuse to buy, then when the U.S. collapses, the world will collapse. Then if the financial crisis spreads throughout the world, what will happen? Other countries will have to prioritize saving America before saving themselves. Remember the financial crisis of 2008? It originated from America and spread globally. But America was the country with the fastest economic recovery. America is still America, but I still have to repeat one thing. If you understand how the mayor works, not only will you make money, but your money-making speed will be faster than any time in the past. Hearing this, some people may say that I am exaggerating, to be honest. I don't blame them because they are probably new, but at least watch my next videos. Actually, I am not trying to prove anything, nor boasting. I just want to remind everyone that there are currently what are the risks and what are the opportunities that we investors are seeing. I just hope that with a little influence of mine, I can help those who are destined to avoid this crisis. At the same time, I also want to tell you that in 2008, many people were just construction workers or waiters in a hot pot restaurant. But now many of them have become rich people around me. After 2008, the gap between rich and poor is fixed. Those who used to be waiters now do not need to do anything. The assets in their hands are constantly generating profits, even every month or every hour, earning an amount of money that many people cannot earn in their entire life. I was born later, so I was too young to seize that opportunity, but this time the opportunity may come again. And I've grown up. More importantly, if the opportunity really comes, I'm ready. I've rolled up my sleeves, and if it doesn't come, that's okay. We just need to re-strategize. In the coming time, we will monitor the U.S. bond market, but this is not a long-term strategy, but only a short-term speculative trade. Because as said, if the U.S. bonds are saved, then the government can continue to print money, and the bond price will increase even more. But what if it cannot be saved? So our strategy is hit fast and short. Get out when you have a profit, just like a gorilla. If you find any part of today's video that you don't understand, I recommend you watch it again because all my logic is closely linked. There have been many big fluctuations in the market recently, but because of limited time, so I will stop here. I share free knowledge on how to become a rich entrepreneur and investor to achieve financial freedom if you don't want to miss it. Subscribe to my channel, turn on the notification bell, and share this video with everyone. I also send my best wishes to all who have liked this video. Wish you guys soon achieve financial freedom. Just in today's content, you find one or two useful quotes to help improve your life. Then I feel satisfied.